highly.
On August 19th in 1791, the accomplished American mathematician and astronomer Benjamin Banneker pens a letter to then Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson corresponds prolifically with luminaries from around the world, but Banneker is unique among them. The son of a free black American woman and a formerly enslaved African man from Guinea, Banneker criticizes Jefferson's hypocritical stance on slavery in respectful but unambiguous terms, using Jefferson's own words to make his case for the abolition of slavery. Benjamin Banneker himself was born free in what is now Ellicott City, Maryland, and was encouraged in his studies of astronomy and mathematics by the Ellicotts, a Quaker family who owned a mill and much of the land in the area. Predicting a solar eclipse and constructing a functioning clock that struck on the hour were among his early achievements. His prowess caught the eye of Jefferson after Mayor Andrew Ellicott chose Banneker to assist him in surveying the original boundaries of what will become the District of Columbia. Banneker also compiled several ephemerides. Ephemerides are a type of astronomical chart, and he also compiled almanacs. In August of 1791, Banneker sent Jefferson, who was known both as a founding father and a devoted scientist, a draft of an almanac he was readying for publication. He felt compelled to include a personal note. In this letter, Banneker quoted the famous preamble of the Declaration of Independence, quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal," unquote, and said plainly that he was disappointed in the hypocrisy of Jefferson, a slave owner. Benjamin Banneker's quote, "But sir, how pitiable is it to reflect that although you were so fully convinced of the benevolence of the Father of mankind and of his equal and impartial distribution of those rights and privileges which he had conferred upon them, that you should at the same time counteract his mercies in detaining by fraud and violence so numerous a part of my brethren under groaning captivity and cruel oppression, that you should at the same time be found guilty of that most criminal act which you professedly detested in others, with respect to yourselves," unquote. Jefferson's response 11 days later was cordial and complimentary, but also condescending and racist. Jefferson praised the almanac and informed Banneker that he was sending it along to Marquis de Condorcet, a French philosopher, mathematician, and abolitionist. The future president praised Banneker as a credit to the black race, essentially telling him that he considered the almanac evidence that African Americans' inferiority was owed, quote, "merely to the degraded condition of their existence both in Africa and America," unquote, and not to their innate inferiority, a paternalistic sentiment that was a frequent topic of debate among whites. After Benjamin Banneker continued his eternity, Jefferson expressed doubt that a black man could have written the almanac. He continued to own enslaved workers despite decrying slavery in some of his writings until his own continuance of eternity in 1826. Shortly after they were written, a Philadelphia publisher circulated a pamphlet containing Banneker's eloquent argument for abolition and Jefferson's non-committal response, which made the rounds among the nascent abolitionist movement. Contrary to the myth that slavery was universally accepted among educated and elite circles in the United States, Banneker's letter stands as proof that one of the nation's founders received first-hand criticism of his hypocritical and contradictory stance on slavery in his lifetime. 19th in 1953, a CIA-assisted coup overthrows the government of Iran. The Iranian military, with the support and financial assistance of the United States government, overthrows the government of Premier Mohammad Mossadegh and reinstates the Shah of Iran. Iran remained a solid Cold War ally of our nation until a revolution ended the Shah's rule in 1979. Mossadegh came to prominence in Iran in 1951 when he was appointed premier. A fierce nationalist, Mossadegh immediately begins attack on British oil companies operating in his country, calling for expropriation and nationalization of the oil fields. His actions brought him into conflict with the pro-Western elites of Iran and the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Indeed, the Shah dismissed Mossadegh in mid-1952, but massive public riots condemning the action forced the Shah to reinstate Mossadegh a short time later. U.S. officials watched events in Iran with growing suspicion. British intelligence sources working with the American Central Intelligence Agency came to the conclusion that Mossadegh had communist leanings and would move Iran into the Soviet orbit if allowed to stay in power. Working with the Shah, the CIA and British intelligence began to engineer a plot to overthrow Mossadegh. The Iranian premier, however, got wind of the plan and called his supporters to take to the streets in protest. At this point, the Shah left the country for medical reasons. While British intelligence backed away from the debacle, the CIA continued its covert operations in Iran. Working with pro-Shah forces and, most importantly, the Iranian military, the CIA cajoled, threatened, and bribed its way into influence and helped to organize another coup attempt against Mossadegh. On August 19, 1953, the military, backed by street protests organized and financed by the CIA, overthrew Mossadegh. The Shah quickly returned to take power, and as thanks for the American help, signed over 40% of Iran's oil fields to U.S. companies. Mossadegh was arrested, served 3 years in prison, and continued his eternity under house arrest in 1967. The Shah became one of our nation's most trusted Cold War allies, and U.S. economic and military aid poured into Iran during the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. In 1978, however, anti-Shah and anti-American protests broke out in Iran, and the Shah was toppled from power in 1979. Militants seized the U.S. embassy and held the American staff hostage until January 1981. Nationalism, not communism, proved to be the most serious threat to U.S. power in Iran. On August 19th in 2011, three men, Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Misskelley, who were convicted as teenagers in 1994 of the murders of three boys in Arkansas, are released from prison in a special legal deal allowing them to maintain their innocence while acknowledging that prosecutors had sufficient evidence to convict them. Echols, 36, had been on death row, while Baldwin, 34, and Misskelley, 36, were serving life sentences. Collectively known as the West Memphis Three, the men had always maintained their innocence, and questions about the evidence used to convict them had persisted for years. Their case attracted widespread attention and the support of a number of celebrities. In May 1993, the bodies of three 8-year-old boys, Christopher Byers, Steve Branch, and Michael Moore, were found naked and hogtied in a drainage ditch in a wooded section of West Memphis, Arkansas. Investigators initially had few solid leads. However, because the bodies appeared to have been mutilated, rumors circulated about a possible connection to satanic cult activities. A tip eventually led investigators to focus on the teenager Damien Echols, a high school dropout who grew up poor and was interested in witchcraft and regularly wore black clothing. Then Misskelley, an acquaintance of Echols, confessed to the murders following a lengthy interrogation by authorities and implicated Echols and Baldwin. Described as having a below-average IQ, Misskelley provided information about the crime that conflicted in key ways from details known to the police, and he soon recanted his confession. Nevertheless, in February of 1994, he was convicted of first and second degree murder and sentenced to life in prison plus 40 years. In a separate trial in March of 1994, Echols and Baldwin were convicted of capital murder. During the trial, Miss Kelly refused to testify against the two, and prosecutors had no eyewitnesses or physical evidence linking Echols and Baldwin to the crime. Instead, the prosecution presented evidence that Echols, the alleged ringleader, read books about witchcraft as well as novels by Stephen King and Anne Rice, and said he was motivated to murder the boys as part of an occult ritual. The case gained national attention with the release of the 1996 documentary Paradise Lost: The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills, which cast doubt on the men's guilt. A movement grew to free the West Memphis Three, and celebrities including Pearl Jam frontman Eddie Vedder, Dixie Chicks singer Natalie Maines, and film director Peter Jackson spoke out in support of the three men and helped fund a legal team to fight the convictions. In 2007, lawyers for the West Memphis Three said new forensic tests showed there was no DNA evidence to link the men to the crime. In the fall of 2010, the Arkansas Supreme Court ordered a hearing for Echols, Baldwin, and Miss Kelly to determine if they deserved new trials. However, before the hearing took place, the trio's lawyers and prosecutors in Arkansas reached a deal allowing the men to enter an Alford plea and go free. With this little-used legal tool, a defendant is allowed to maintain his or her innocence but plead guilty because it is considered in his or her best interest to do so. In a statement following his release from custody on August 19th in 2011, Echols said in part of the plea deal, quote, "I have now spent half my life on death row. It is a torturous environment that no human being should have to endure, and it needed to end. I am innocent, as are Jason and Jesse, but I made this decision because I did not want to spend another day of my life behind those bars," unquote. All historic information divulged and documented on this audio file can be verified on History.com.